The rejection letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the casual cruelty that only certified mail could provide. Isolde Bennett stood in her cramped studio apartment, the paper trembling in her hands as she read the words that would change everything. We regret to inform you that Bennett Digital Solutions does not meet our criteria for serious business partnerships. We suggest you reconsider your approach to entrepreneurship. The letter bore the letterhead of Meridian Corp, the tech giant that dominated their city like a glass and steel colossus. Below the corporate logo, someone had scrawled in red ink, "This is a joke, right?" Isolde's fingers tightened around the paper, creating small wrinkles that spiderwebbed across the rejection. Outside her window, the Seattle skyline stretched endlessly, each building a monument to someone else's success. The Space Needle pierced the gray morning sky like an accusation, reminding her of dreams that seemed as distant as the stars it once reached toward. Her phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, vibrating with an urgency that made her stomach clench. The caller ID showed Marcus Rivera, her former colleague from her corporate days at TechFlow Industries. She almost didn't answer. Marcus had been one of the loudest voices questioning her decision to leave a stable six-figure salary to start her own consulting firm. "Isolde, you need to see the news," Marcus said without preamble, his voice tight with something she couldn't identify. "Turn on Channel 7. The local news anchor's voice filled her small space with practiced authority. Breaking news this morning as TechFlow Industries announces massive layoffs affecting nearly 60% of their workforce. CEO David Kellerman cited market pressures and the need for restructuring as primary factors in the decision to eliminate over 3,000 positions. Isolde sank onto her second-hand couch, the rejection letter forgotten on the floor. The irony struck her like a physical blow. The same company she'd left 6 months ago, the same executives who'd called her naive for thinking she could make it on her own, were now scrambling to explain how they'd miscalculated so catastrophically. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, its screen displaying her business bank account. $847.32. Not enough to pay next month's rent, barely enough to keep the lights on. But as she watched the news coverage, something shifted inside her chest. The reporter was interviewing laid-off employees on the sidewalk outside TechFlow's downtown office, their faces blank with shock and betrayal. "I gave them 12 years, one woman said, clutching a box of personal items. "They told us last week that everything was fine, that our jobs were secure. Now they're saying the whole department is redundant." Isolde recognized the woman, Sarah Chen, a brilliant project manager who'd trained 3 junior employees in her last year at TechFlow. Sarah had been the one to suggest Isolde was making a mistake by leaving a stable 6-figure salary to start her own consulting firm. "You're walking away from security," she had said during Isolde's farewell lunch. "Small businesses fail. Corporate jobs last." The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in with the weight of her own doubts. Isolde had started Bennett Digital Solutions with a vision that seemed almost embarrassingly simple now: help small businesses navigate the complex world of digital transformation without the crushing expense of hiring major consulting firms. She'd seen how companies like Meridian Corp and TechFlow Industries priced out smaller competitors, creating a system where only the already powerful could access the tools they needed to grow. Her first client was Rosa Martinez, who owned a struggling bakery in the International District. Rosa had been trying for months to set up online ordering, but every consulting firm she contacted wanted retainers she couldn't afford. Isolde had helped her build a simple but effective system for $300, a fraction of what the big firms would have charged. Within 2 months, Rosa's online orders had tripled her evening revenue.
But success stories like Rosa's didn't impress companies like Meridian Corp. They wanted to see enterprise-level clients, Fortune 500 partnerships, the kind of credentials that Isolde's one-woman operation couldn't provide. Every pitch meeting ended the same way: polite interest, followed by inevitable rejection. "Come back when you have more experience with our scale of operations." The notification sound from her laptop pulled her back to the present. An email from her bank reminding her that her business loan payment was due in 3 days. Another email from her landlord asking about next month's rent. A third from the Seattle Small Business Association inviting her to attend a networking event she couldn't afford. But buried between the bills and obligations was something else. An email from someone named David Park, sent at 2:47 a.m. The subject line read, "Urgent, need your help." Isolde opened the message, her heart rate quickening as she read, "Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel." Miss Bennett, I got your contact information from Rosa Martinez at Estrella Bakery. She said you helped her with digital systems. I'm the operations manager for a chain of 5 restaurants, and we're drowning. Our IT consultant just quit, left us with systems we can't understand or maintain. We have payroll due tomorrow, and our POS system crashed. Can you help? I can pay whatever you need. She checked the timestamp again, sent just hours after the TechFlow layoffs were announced. David Park. The name sounded familiar. She opened LinkedIn and searched, finding his profile immediately. Operations manager at Cascade Dining Group. Previously, senior systems analyst at TechFlow Industries. The photo showed a man in his 40s with kind eyes and graying temples, standing in front of what looked like a busy restaurant kitchen. His last post was from 3 days ago, a cheerful update about menu changes and seasonal specials. Nothing about layoffs or lost jobs. Isolde's fingers hovered over the keyboard. This was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been waiting for. A real business with real problems that needed immediate solutions. But David Park didn't know yet that she was the same Isolde Bennett who'd been laughed out of every major consulting firm in the city. The same woman whose business had been called a joke by the very industry she was trying to enter. Her phone rang again, startling her from her thoughts. This time, it was an unknown number with a local area code. Bennett Digital Solutions? Miss Bennett, this is Jennifer Walsh. I just got laid off from TechFlow, and a friend of mine said you might be able to help small businesses with digital consulting. I'm thinking about starting my own practice, but I have no idea how to set up the technical side. Isolde blinked, recognizing the name. Jennifer Walsh had been a senior developer at TechFlow, one of the people she'd occasionally collaborated with on cross-department projects. Jennifer had never been unkind, but she'd also never taken Isolde's business seriously. During a coffee break, Jennifer had mentioned that consulting firms needed serious backing to succeed. I can help, Isolde said carefully. What kind of practice are you thinking about starting? Freelance web development. I have clients lined up, but I need help with project management systems, client communication platforms, invoicing software, all the business infrastructure stuff. The corporate world handles all of that for you, you know? I never realized how much I didn't know about running a business. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, ending with Jennifer booking a consultation for the following day. After hanging up, Isolde said in the quiet of her apartment, the rejection letter still crumpled on the floor beside her feet.
Her old jewelry box sat on the windowsill, a small wooden thing her grandmother had given her before she died. Inside, beneath a tangle of costume jewelry, was a silver compass that had belonged to her great-grandfather, a merchant marine who'd navigated ships across the Pacific during World War II. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands on the day she graduated from college. This compass guided your great-grandfather through storms and fog, she'd said. Sometimes you can't see where you're going, but you can still choose your direction. Isolde picked up the compass now, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. The needle swung gently before settling on magnetic north, pointing toward the window that faced downtown Seattle. Somewhere out there, David Park was probably staring at broken restaurant systems, wondering how he was going to make payroll. Jennifer Walsh was likely updating her resume and questioning everything she thought she knew about her career. And in the gleaming towers of Meridian Corp and TechFlow Industries, executives who'd built their success on excluding people like Isolde were now scrambling to understand how their carefully constructed world had suddenly become so unstable. She opened her laptop and began typing a response to David Park's email. But as she wrote, a question formed in her mind that would haunt her through the coming months. What happened when the people who'd been dismissed as jokes suddenly became the solution everyone desperately needed? The morning rain had started while she worked, drumming against her window with a rhythm that sounded almost like applause. On the floor, the rejection letter from Meridian Corp grew damp from a small leak in the window frame, the red ink beginning to run. The word joke blurred until it became unreadable, dissolving like a cruel promise being washed away. Isolde Bennett had never intended to become an entrepreneur. Growing up in the Ballard neighborhood of Seattle, she'd watched her father struggle to keep his small maritime supply business afloat, while larger corporations systematically undercut his prices and stole his customers. By the time she graduated high school, Nordstrom Marine Supply had been reduced to a single cramped storefront that smelled of salt water and broken dreams. "Get a real job," her father had told her on the night before her first day at the University of Washington. "Work for someone else. Let them worry about making payroll and keeping the lights on. Security is worth more than independence." She'd taken his advice to heart, spending 4 years studying information systems and another 2 earning an MBA with a focus on technology management. Her grades had been good enough to land her a position at TechFlow Industries straight out of graduate school, where she'd climbed steadily through the ranks for 8 years, director of client relations by 30, with a corner office, a reliable salary, and the kind of comprehensive benefits package that made her parents proud. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd ended up exactly where her father had wanted her to be, yet felt more trapped than he ever had in his failing business. Her daily routine at TechFlow had been as predictable as clockwork. 6:30 a.m. alarm, 20 minutes of coffee and news, 30-minute commute through downtown traffic. She'd arrive at the 32nd floor of the Columbia Center by 8:15, spend 10 minutes reviewing her schedule with her assistant, then dive into the endless cycle of client meetings, project reviews, and strategic planning sessions that filled her days from 8:30 to 6:30. The work itself had been engaging enough, helping Fortune 500 companies streamline their operations, implement new software systems, navigate digital transformations. But something had felt fundamentally wrong about the process. TechFlow's smallest consulting package started at $50,000, effectively excluding any business that couldn't afford to spend more on consulting than many people earned in a year. In her last year at the company, Isolde had proposed creating a small business division, offering scaled-down services at accessible price points. The idea had been shut down in a 15-minute meeting with the executive committee. "Our brand is built on prestige," CEO David Kellerman had explained, his tone patient but firm. "Small businesses can't afford quality consulting, and attempting to serve them would dilute our market position. We're not Walmart, we're Nordstrom." The comparison had stung more than he could have known. Her father's business had failed partly because customers increasingly chose Walmart over local shops, prioritizing price over relationship, convenience over character. Now she was part of a system that enforced those same divisions on a different scale. The breaking point had come during a client presentation to Meridian Corp. Isolde had spent 3 weeks preparing a comprehensive digital transformation strategy for their supply chain operations. The proposal was solid, innovative, and would have saved them millions in operational costs. But halfway through her presentation, Meridian's CTO had interrupted her. "This is good work," he'd said, "but we're looking for solutions that come from established industry leaders. TechFlow is certainly capable, but we need a consulting partner with more gravitas." The contract had gone to McKinsey & Company, despite their proposal being nearly identical to Isolde's work and costing 30% more. Later, she'd learned through industry contacts that Meridian's decision had been influenced by McKinsey's client roster and brand recognition, rather than the quality of their actual proposal. That night, she'd gone home to her Capitol Hill apartment and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror for a long time. At 35, she'd achieved everything she was supposed to want: professional success, financial stability, industry recognition. But the woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger. someone who'd spent so many years following other people's definitions of success that she'd forgotten what her own looked like. The decision to leave TechFlow had taken 3 months of agonizing deliberation. She'd made lists of pros and cons, calculated her savings down to the penny, researched market conditions until her eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. The rational part of her brain presented compelling arguments against taking such a risk. The failure rate of new businesses, the competitive landscape of consulting, the comfort and security of her current position. But there was another voice, quieter but more persistent, that whispered about the small businesses she could help, the entrepreneurs who were dismissed by firms like TechFlow, the possibility of building something that aligned with her values, rather than just her bank account. Her resignation letter had been 2 sentences long. Please accept my resignation from my position as Director of Client Relations, effective 2 weeks from today. I will be starting my own consulting practice focused on serving small and medium-sized businesses. The reactions from her colleagues had ranged from bewildered to condescending. Marcus Rivera, her closest work friend, had taken her to lunch 3 times trying to talk her out of it. "You're having a midlife crisis," he'd said during their final conversation. "Take a sabbatical, travel to Europe, get some perspective. Don't throw away your career over some fantasy about helping small businesses." Her direct reports had been supportive, but worried. Jennifer Walsh had pulled her aside during her farewell party to ask, "Are you sure about this? Consulting is really competitive, and most small businesses can't afford the kind of rates you'd need to make this worthwhile." Even her parents, who'd initially expressed pride in her entrepreneurial spirit, had gradually become more concerned as the reality of her decision set in. Her mother called every Sunday now, conversations that inevitably included questions about her financial situation and subtle suggestions about keeping her options open for returning to corporate work. The first month of Bennett Digital Solutions had been a masterclass in entrepreneurial humility. Isolde had rented the smallest office space she could find in a converted warehouse in Georgetown, furnished it with IKEA furniture and secondhand equipment, and launched a website that she'd built herself using YouTube tutorials and sheer determination. Her business plan had been optimistically simple, offered the same quality consulting services she'd provided at TechFlow, but at prices small businesses could afford. She'd calculated that she could maintain her lifestyle on a quarter of her previous salary if she kept her overhead low and focused on volume rather than high-dollar contracts.
The reality had been more complicated. Small business owners, it turned out, were often skeptical of consultants in general, having been burned by previous experiences with firms that overpromised and underdelivered. They wanted to see results before paying for services, needed payment plans rather than upfront retainers, and required a level of personal attention that made scaling difficult. Her first 3 months had yielded exactly 1 client, Rosa Martinez and her bakery. The project had been successful beyond both of their expectations, but it had also consumed nearly 60 hours of work for a total payment of $300. When Isolde calculated her effective hourly rate, it worked out to less than minimum wage. Still, something about the work felt right in a way her corporate job never had. Rosa's excitement when her online ordering system went live, the way her evening sales tripled within weeks, the handwritten thank you note she'd sent with a box of homemade conchas, these moments provided a satisfaction that no TechFlow performance bonus had ever matched. But satisfaction didn't pay rent or student loans. By month 4, Isolde had burned through most of her savings and was facing the uncomfortable reality that her father might have been right about security being worth more than independence. Her apartment had become a reflection of her internal state, organized but sparse, efficient but lonely. The kitchen table served as her desk, the bedroom closet housed her server equipment, and the living room had been converted into a client meeting space with folding chairs and a portable projector.
She'd canceled her Netflix subscription, started buying generic groceries, and had worn the same 3 business outfits to every client meeting for 2 months. The loneliness was perhaps the most unexpected challenge. After 8 years of constant interaction with colleagues, clients, and collaborators, the isolation of working alone was jarring. Some days her only human interaction was with the barista at the coffee shop where she worked when she needed a change of scenery from her apartment. She tried joining entrepreneurial networking groups, but found herself feeling out of place among the startup founders discussing venture capital and scaling strategies. Her goals seemed almost quaint by comparison: help small businesses solve immediate problems, charge fair prices, and build sustainable relationships. She wasn't trying to disrupt entire industries or achieve explosive growth. She just wanted to create something meaningful and financially viable. The rejection from Meridian Corp had been particularly devastating because it represented validation she desperately needed. Landing a contract with a major corporation would have proven to her doubters and to herself that Bennett Digital Solutions was a legitimate business rather than an expensive hobby. But as she prepared for her meeting with David Park, Isolde remembered something her great-grandfather had written in a letter to her grandmother during the war. She discovered it in her grandmother's papers after she died, tucked inside the same jewelry box that now held his compass. The storms don't ask if you're ready for them, they just come. But I've learned that the same wind that sinks one ship can fill another's sails, depending on how you position yourself. David Park's email had arrived like an unexpected wind, carrying both opportunity and responsibility. As she researched Cascade Dining Group and prepared for their meeting, she realized that this moment, this intersection of her struggle and someone else's crisis, might be exactly the positioning her great-grandfather had written about. The compass on her windowsill caught the late afternoon light as she closed her laptop and prepared to leave for her meeting. Its needle pointed steadily north, unwavering despite the electromagnetic interference from her phone and computer. Some things, she thought, maintained their direction regardless of the chaos around them. The Cascade Dining Group's flagship restaurant occupied a corner lot in Pike Place Market, its windows offering a view of Elliott Bay that would have been stunning if they hadn't been fogged with condensation from the kitchen's overworked ventilation system. Isolde arrived 15 minutes early, watching through the glass as servers moved with the controlled panic of people working with broken systems.
David Park met her at the entrance, his LinkedIn photo having failed to capture the exhaustion that lined his face or the coffee stains on his wrinkled shirt. Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming so quickly. I've been here since 4 a.m. trying to get our point-of-sale system to process yesterday's transactions. The interior revealed the full scope of the crisis. Behind the hostess station, 3 different laptops were connected to a tangle of cables and Ethernet adapters. A handwritten sign taped to the cash register read, "Cash only, system down." The lunch crowd was sparse, probably driven away by the inconvenience of the cash-only policy. "Tell me everything," Isolde said, pulling out her notebook and settling into a booth near the kitchen. David's story unfolded like a case study in corporate negligence. TechFlow Industries had been Cascade Dining Group's IT consultant for 3 years, managing everything from payroll systems to inventory tracking. The relationship had been expensive but stable until the layoffs hit. Our account manager was Jennifer Walsh. She'd been with us since the beginning, knew our systems inside and out. Then, last Tuesday, she sends an email saying she's been terminated effective immediately and we'd be transitioned to a new consultant, except nobody ever contacted us. The new consultant, it turned out, was actually an automated system, TechFlow's attempt to reduce costs by replacing human support with chatbots and standardized troubleshooting protocols. When Cascade's POS system crashed on Thursday night, David had spent 6 hours navigating phone trees and chat windows, only to be told that his support tier didn't include emergency assistance. They wanted to charge us $12,000 to send a technician, $12,000 to fix a problem that Jennifer could have solved remotely in 20 minutes.
But the POS system was only the beginning. As Isolde dug deeper, she discovered a web of dependencies that TechFlow had created and maintained without ever documenting for the client. The payroll system connected to the POS data through a custom integration that existed nowhere in writing. Inventory management relied on a third-party API that TechFlow managed through their own servers. Even the restaurant's website was hosted on TechFlow's infrastructure, inaccessible now that their account had been suspended for non-payment of the emergency service fee. "How many restaurants in your group?" Isolde asked, already dreading the answer. 5, and they're all connected through the same systems. The scope of the problem was staggering. 5 restaurants, each serving between 200 and 300 customers daily, all dependent on systems that had been essentially abandoned by their creator. David had payroll due for 43 employees in less than 24 hours, and no way to calculate how many hours they'd worked or how much they were owed. "What about other IT consultants? Have you reached out to anyone else?" David's laugh was bitter. "I've called 8 firms since Wednesday. The smallest retainer anyone would consider is $15,000, just to assess the situation. Most of them won't even return my calls once they realize we're not a Fortune 500 company." This was the ecosystem Isolde had left TechFlow to escape, a system where emergency support was priced as a luxury item, where small businesses were considered unworthy of the same service quality that large corporations received as a matter of course. She thought of her former colleagues, probably dealing with their own job searches and career uncertainties, while their abandoned clients struggled with critical system failures. "I can help," Isolde said simply. "But you need to understand what we're dealing with. This isn't just a broken system. It's a deliberately complex architecture designed to create vendor lock-in. TechFlow built these dependencies to make it expensive and difficult for you to leave."
Over the next 4 hours, Isolde performed digital archaeology, tracing connections and mapping data flows like an explorer charting unknown territory. She worked from David's cluttered office above the restaurant, surrounded by printouts of error messages and sticky notes with passwords that no longer worked. The deeper she dug, the more intentional TechFlow's strategy became apparent. They'd used proprietary file formats that couldn't be opened by standard software. Critical data was stored on their servers with no local backups. Even simple functions like printing receipts required authentication from TechFlow's central system. "This is deliberate," Isolde told David as the afternoon stretched toward evening. "They've essentially held your business hostage. Every system depends on their infrastructure in a way that makes it nearly impossible to migrate to a different solution." By 8 p.m., she'd managed to create a temporary workaround that allowed one restaurant to process credit card payments and calculate basic payroll. It was an ugly solution, a patchwork of spreadsheets and manual processes, but it would keep the business operational while she worked on something more permanent. David insisted on paying her immediately, writing a check for $2,000 despite her protests that they should wait until the work was complete. "You've already done more in 6 hours than TechFlow accomplished in the last month," he said, "and you're the first consultant who didn't treat us like we were wasting your time." Walking back to her car through the empty Pike Place Market, Isolde felt the weight of what she'd undertaken. Cascade Dining Group wasn't just a client. They were a lifeline for 43 employees who depended on steady paychecks, for suppliers who relied on regular payments, for a neighborhood that had come to expect their presence on the corner. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Rivera. "Saw on LinkedIn that Jennifer Walsh is starting her own consulting practice. Maybe you two should team up. Could be good for both of you." The suggestion struck her as both ironic and potentially brilliant. Jennifer had the technical expertise that Isolde needed, and Isolde had the business relationships and market positioning that Jennifer lacked. But there was something else, a growing realization that the crisis at Cascade Dining Group wasn't isolated. Over the following week, Isolde's phone rang with increasing frequency. Each call followed the same pattern: a small business owner whose IT consultant had disappeared during the TechFlow layoffs, systems that had been designed to be maintained by people who were no longer available, emergency situations that larger consulting firms wouldn't touch without enormous upfront fees. There was Maria Santos, who owned a small accounting practice and discovered that her client management system had been hosted entirely on TechFlow's servers. When her account was suspended, she lost access to 10 years of client files and financial records.
James Mitchell ran a boutique marketing agency that had relied on TechFlow's custom CRM system. Without access to client contact information and project histories, his business was essentially paralyzed. Sarah Kim owned a small manufacturing company whose entire quality control system was built on TechFlow's proprietary software. With production deadlines looming and no way to track defects or manage inventory, she was facing her first missed delivery in 8 years. Each story followed the same pattern: small businesses that had been sold complex, expensive solutions by TechFlow's sales team, then abandoned when the company decided they were no longer profitable to support. The consulting giant had extracted thousands of dollars from each client while creating systems that couldn't function independently. It's like digital sharecropping, Isolde explained to Jennifer Walsh during their first meeting at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. They'd agreed to meet after Jennifer reached out for help setting up her own practice, but the conversation had quickly evolved into something larger. "What do you mean?" Jennifer asked, looking up from the legal pad where she'd been taking notes about business registration and tax requirements.
TechFlow created a system where small businesses paid for tools they could never truly own. They couldn't modify them, couldn't migrate the data, couldn't even understand how they worked. They were tenant farmers in TechFlow's digital plantation, paying rent for tools that kept them dependent. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, stirring her latte with a wooden stick. "I never thought about it that way when I was on the inside. We just saw it as recurring revenue, sustainable business model. But you're right, we were designing dependence." The conversation marked the beginning of what would become an unlikely partnership. Jennifer brought 15 years of technical expertise and deep knowledge of TechFlow's systems. Isolde offered business development skills, client relationships, and a vision of what consulting could look like when it prioritized client independence over vendor lock-in. Their first joint project was rescuing the Cascade Dining Group systems, a process that took 3 weeks and required building entirely new architectures from scratch. Instead of recreating TechFlow's complex dependencies, they designed modular systems that could be understood, modified, and maintained by the clients themselves. But as word spread about their success, both women began to understand the true scope of the problem they'd uncovered. The TechFlow layoffs had created a crisis that extended far beyond individual businesses. An entire ecosystem of small companies had been built on foundations that were suddenly inaccessible, like a neighborhood whose only bridge to the mainland had been washed out by a storm. The responses from the larger consulting industry were predictably self-serving. McKinsey & Company issued a press release about their Small Business Recovery Initiative, offering assessment services starting at $25,000. Deloitte announced a crisis management practice, with retainers beginning at $50,000. Even smaller regional firms saw an opportunity to charge premium rates for emergency services. "They're treating this like a natural disaster," Isolde told Jennifer as they worked late one night in the makeshift office space they'd rented in Georgetown. "Something that just happened instead of something that was created by the industry's own practices." The moral weight of their work was becoming increasingly clear. Every system they rebuilt represented not just technical problems, but human lives. Employees who needed steady paychecks, families who depended on small business services, communities that relied on local economic stability. As they finished their work on the Cascade Dining Group project, David Park had gathered his management team to thank them. "You didn't just fix our computers," he said. "You saved 43 jobs and 5 businesses. That's not consulting. That's community work." The comment stayed with Isolde as she drove home through the quiet Seattle streets. Community work. It wasn't a phrase she'd ever associated with her corporate career, but it perfectly captured what Bennett Digital Solutions was becoming. Not just a business, but a response to market failure, a way of serving people who'd been systematically excluded from an industry that claimed to help businesses succeed. Her apartment felt different now, less like a temporary refuge and more like a headquarters. The compass on her windowsill pointed north as always, but she was beginning to understand that magnetic north and true north weren't always the same thing. Sometimes you had to choose between following the safe, predictable path and heading toward the destination that actually mattered.
The real conflict, she was learning, wasn't between her business and the competition. It was between two fundamentally different visions of what consulting should be: extraction or empowerment, dependence or independence, serving shareholders or serving communities. And the stakes, she was beginning to realize, were much higher than she had initially understood. The breakthrough came at 2:14 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning. 3 months after the TechFlow layoffs had sent shockwaves through Seattle's small business community, Isolde sat in her Georgetown office, surrounded by printouts, coffee cups, and the digital debris of a dozen
Failed attempts to reverse engineer TechFlow's proprietary systems. Jennifer Walsh was asleep on the couch they'd bought for all-night sessions, her laptop still warm on her chest. The revelation wasn't dramatic, no sudden flash of insight, no eureka moment. Instead, it emerged gradually, as Isolde traced through lines of code that shouldn't have existed, database connections that served no apparent purpose, and file structures that seemed designed to confuse rather than organize. TechFlow hadn't just created vendor lock-in through complex dependencies. They had deliberately sabotaged their own systems to ensure client retention. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. In the code that managed Cascade Dining Group's inventory system, Isolde found functions that randomly corrupted data if the authentication server couldn't be reached for more than 72 hours. The payroll system included deliberate errors that would compound over time, creating discrepancies that only TechFlow's proprietary reconciliation tools could resolve. Most damning of all was the discovery in Maria Santos's accounting software, a hidden routine that gradually shifted decimal places in financial calculations, creating errors so small they wouldn't be noticed in daily operations, but would cause catastrophic failures during tax preparation or audits. "Jennifer," Isolde said softly, her voice hoarse from hours of concentrated work, "wake up. You need to see this." Jennifer stirred, pushing her hair back from her face and blinking at the screen. As Isolde explained what she'd found, Jennifer's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching horror. "That's impossible," Jennifer said, leaning forward to examine the code more closely. "We would never. I mean, there are standards, professional ethics." Her voice trailed off as she recognized familiar programming patterns, commenting styles that she knew belonged to specific developers in TechFlow's engineering department. "You knew about this," Isolde said, not accusingly, but with a kind of sad certainty. "No, sort of. But there were things that didn't make sense. Client support calls about problems that seemed almost designed to happen, error patterns that were too consistent to be random, and management always pushed back when we suggested fixing root causes instead of just treating symptoms." The next few hours revealed the full scope of what they'd discovered. TechFlow's business model hadn't just been based on creating dependency, it had been built on engineering failure. Systems were designed to break down in ways that required ongoing maintenance contracts. Software updates introduced new incompatibilities that necessitated additional consulting services. Even security patches included vulnerabilities that would manifest months later, ensuring a steady stream of emergency service calls. "This is fraud," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is deliberate sabotage of client systems. People could lose their businesses because of this." But as shocking as the technical revelations were, the human implications were even more devastating. Over the following weeks, as Isolde and Jennifer quietly investigated other TechFlow installations, they found evidence of the strategy's real-world impact. Rosa Martinez's bakery had been slowly hemorrhaging money due to
inventory shrinkage that was actually caused by deliberate miscalculations in TechFlow's stock management system. She had been considering closing the business, unable to understand why her ingredient costs never aligned with her sales. James Mitchell's marketing agency had lost 3 major clients when TechFlow's CRM system accidentally sent confidential strategy documents to competitors. The error had been blamed on user mistakes, but the forensic analysis revealed that it was triggered by a hidden function in the software.
Sarah Kim's manufacturing company had been flagged by regulatory inspectors for quality control failures that were directly caused by TechFlow's system randomly altering safety specifications. She'd spent over $30,000 in fines and remediation costs, money that had been extracted from a small business that was already struggling to compete with larger manufacturers. The pattern was consistent across dozens of TechFlow clients. Systematic sabotage, disguised as technical problems designed to extract ongoing revenue while keeping clients dependent and vulnerable. "We have to report this," Jennifer said during one of their late-night discovery sessions. "This isn't just bad business practice, it's criminal." But who would they report it to? TechFlow's clients had signed agreements that included mandatory arbitration clauses and limitations on damages. The company's legal team had carefully crafted contracts that made class action lawsuits nearly impossible. Regulatory agencies were understaffed and focused on larger-scale fraud cases that affected consumers rather than businesses. More importantly, TechFlow's executives were already insulated from the consequences of their actions. The company had been sold to a private equity firm 6 months before the layoffs, with David Kellerman and the senior leadership team walking away with golden parachutes worth millions. The new owners were already planning to liquidate TechFlow's assets and intellectual property, leaving behind only legal entities with no meaningful resources to pursue. The revelation came during a conversation with Marcus Rivera, who had landed at a smaller consulting firm after the TechFlow layoffs. "You didn't know?" he asked Isolde during a chance encounter at a downtown coffee shop. "The sale was announced internally in February. Management knew the layoffs were coming for months. That's why they were so aggressive about signing new maintenance contracts in the fourth quarter. They were pumping up the recurring revenue numbers to make the company look more valuable." The betrayal was breathtaking in its scoop and cynicism. TechFlow's leadership had known they were abandoning their clients, had known the systems would fail, had known that small businesses would be left with expensive broken tools and no way to fix them. But rather than preparing clients for the transition or designing systems that could function independently, they had doubled down on creating dependency right until the moment they walked away. Jennifer's reaction was visceral. She'd spent 15 years building her career at TechFlow, believing she was helping businesses solve complex problems. The discovery that her work had actually been weaponized against the clients she thought she was serving left her questioning everything she thought she knew about the industry. "I wrote some of that code," she told Isolde one evening, staring at a printout of the inventory sabotage functions. "Not the malicious parts, I never knew those were being added, but the framework, the basic architecture. I built the foundation that they used to hurt people." The guilt was consuming her, but Isolde recognized something else in Jennifer's reaction. The same moral clarity that had driven her own decision to leave TechFlow in the first place. The same instinct that had led her to help Rosa Martinez for $300 instead of pursuing corporate clients worth $50,000. "We can't change what's already happened," Isolde said, "but we can choose what happens next." The decision to go public with their discoveries wasn't made lightly. Both women understood the risks: potential lawsuits from TechFlow's legal successors, professional retaliation from an industry that valued discretion above accountability, possible damage to their own emerging business if they were perceived as whistleblowers rather than legitimate consultants. But the alternative, keeping quiet while small businesses continued to suffer from deliberately sabotaged systems, felt like complicity. Their first call was to David Park at Cascade Dining Group. When Isolde explained what they'd found in his systems, his reaction was a mixture of rage and relief. All those random crashes,
All those mysterious errors, they were intentional? David's voice carried the weight of months of sleepless nights and stress-induced headaches. Do you know how close we came to bankruptcy? My insurance wouldn't cover business interruption because the problems were classified as software issues, not covered disasters.
But David's anger was quickly replaced by something more constructive. What do we do about it? How do we make sure this doesn't happen to other businesses? The answer came from an unexpected source. Rosa Martinez, the baker who had been Isolde's first client, had been following their work with interest. During a check-in call about her systems, she made a suggestion that would reshape everything. "You should write about this," Rosa said. "Not like a technical report, like a story. Help people understand what really happened. My customers don't care about code, but they care about fairness. They care about small businesses being treated right." The blog post that Isolde had published on Bennett Digital Solutions' website 3 days later was titled, "The Digital Sharecropping System: How TechFlow Industries Systematically Sabotaged Small Business Technology." It was written in plain language, avoiding technical jargon in favor of clear explanations and concrete examples. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times across social media. Small business owners from around the country began reaching out, sharing their own stories of mysterious system failures, escalating support costs, and consultation contracts that seemed designed to never end. Local news outlets picked up the story within days. The Seattle Times ran a front-page article titled, "Local Businesses Allege Deliberate Sabotage by Tech Consulting Giant." KOMO News interviewed David Park and Maria Santos, who described the financial and emotional toll of dealing with systems that seemed designed to fail. But the story gained national attention when the Wall Street Journal's technology reporter, Sarah Chen, the same Sarah Chen who had been laid off from TechFlow, published an investigation that traced the sabotage strategy to TechFlow's highest levels of management. Sarah had kept copies of internal emails and strategy documents from her time at TechFlow, materials that provided smoking gun evidence of the company's intentional sabotage policies, executive memos discussing optimizing client retention through strategic dependency creation, engineering directives to introduce controlled failure points in third-party integrations, and sales training materials that taught consultants to identify and exploit client vulnerabilities. The evidence was damning, but the legal and regulatory response was frustratingly slow. The private equity firm that had purchased TechFlow claimed they had no knowledge of the sabotage practices and no responsibility for cleaning up the damage. State and federal agencies launched investigations, but warned that meaningful action could take months or years. In the meantime, the crisis continued to unfold in real time. More TechFlow clients discovered evidence of sabotage in their systems. Small businesses that had been struggling with mysterious problems for years suddenly understood why their technology had been so unreliable and expensive to maintain. The emotional impact on the affected business owners was profound. Many described feelings of betrayal and violation, not just of their trust, but of their basic assumptions about how business relationships should work. They had paid TechFlow to solve their problems, not to create new ones in service of a long-term extraction strategy. It's like finding out your doctor was making you sick so you'd keep coming back for treatment, Maria Santos told a reporter, except your doctor's bills don't threaten to put you out of business. But alongside the anger and betrayal came something unexpected: recognition and validation for Isolde and Jennifer's work. Business owners who had been told by multiple consulting firms that their problems were too complex or too small to address were suddenly seeing their situations clearly for the first time. The revelation reframed everything about Bennett Digital Solutions' mission. What Isolde had thought was a simple alternative to expensive consulting was actually a form of digital emergency response, helping businesses recover from systematic sabotage while building systems designed for independence rather than dependency. Regional business associations began inviting Isolde to speak at conferences and workshops. The Seattle Small Business Association, which had previously treated her as a curious startup, now recognized her as a leading expert on small business technology independence.
The University of Washington's Business School asked her to guest lecture on ethical consulting practices.
Most significantly, other former TechFlow employees began reaching out. Not just those who had been laid off, but people who had quit in frustration with the company's practices, who had left the industry entirely rather than participate in what they now recognized as a systematic fraud. I always wondered why client problems seemed to get worse instead of better, one former developer told Isolde during a phone interview. Management told us it was because small businesses were inherently chaotic, that they needed more structure and oversight than they wanted to pay for. I never imagined that we were the ones creating the chaos. The growing network of former TechFlow employees became both a resource and a support system. They helped Jennifer and Isolde decode the most complex sabotage mechanisms, provided insider knowledge about other firms that might be using similar strategies, and offered their own services to help affected businesses recover. But perhaps the most important recognition came from the clients themselves. David Park started referring other restaurant owners to Bennett Digital Solutions. Maria Santos recommended them to her accounting clients. Rosa Martinez displayed their business card prominently at her bakery counter, telling customers about the ethical consultants who had saved her business. Word of mouth spread in the way that trust spreads in small business communities, slowly but deeply, based on results rather than marketing. Each successful project led to referrals. Each referral led to relationships. Each relationship strengthened the growing network of businesses that were choosing independence over dependency. The recognition wasn't just professional, it was personal. Isolde found herself invited to family celebrations by clients whose businesses they'd helped save. Jennifer discovered that her work was being discussed in online forums as an example of technology consulting done right. Both women realized that they had stumbled into something much larger than a business strategy. They had become part of a movement toward economic justice in the digital age, toward technology that served users rather than extracting from them, toward business relationships based on empowerment rather than exploitation. Preparing and narrating the story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The compass on Isolde's windowsill had become a symbol that several clients noticed and asked about. When she told them about her great-grandfather's experience navigating through storms, they understood immediately. "That's what you did for us," David Park had said. "You helped us navigate through the storm that someone else created." But as the recognition grew and the business expanded, both women understood that they had only addressed the symptoms of a much larger problem. TechFlow's sabotage strategy hadn't been unique. It was simply the most visible example of an industry-wide approach to small business consulting that prioritized vendor profits over client success. The real question, as they prepared to scale their response to meet growing demand, was whether they could create a sustainable alternative to the extraction economy that had dominated technology consulting for decades. The answer to that question would determine not just the future of Bennett Digital Solutions, but the possibility of a digital economy that actually served the small businesses that formed the backbone of local communities across the country. 6 months after the TechFlow scandal broke, Isolde Bennett stood in the conference room of what had once been a struggling Georgetown warehouse and was now the headquarters of the Pacific Northwest Small Business Technology Cooperative. The space buzzed with the controlled energy of an organization that had grown from an idea into a movement. Jennifer Walsh was leading a training session for their newest cohort of ethical consultants, former corporate employees who had left big firms to join what the industry was now calling the independence movement. On the wall behind her, a whiteboard displayed their core principles: empower, don't extract; build independence, not dependency; serve communities, not just shareholders. The transformation had begun with simple necessity. As more TechFlow victims sought help, Bennett Digital Solutions had been overwhelmed by demand. Isolde and Jennifer found themselves working 18-hour days, traveling across 3 states to help businesses recover from sabotaged systems. The work was meaningful, but unsustainable. They needed to scale their response without compromising their values. The solution came from their clients themselves. David Park had suggested creating a training program that would teach small business owners to maintain their own systems. "You can't be everywhere at once," he'd said during one of their follow-up meetings, "but you can teach us to handle the basic stuff ourselves,
and call you for the complex problems. The first Small Business Technology Independence Workshop had been held in Cascade Dining Group's private dining room, with 12 business owners learning basic system administration, data backup procedures, and vendor evaluation techniques. The response had been overwhelming. Participants left feeling empowered rather than dependent, equipped with knowledge rather than expensive maintenance contracts. Rosa Martinez had been the first to suggest formalizing the cooperative structure. In Mexico, my grandmother belonged to a cooperative that helped small farmers buy seeds and equipment together. They shared resources and knowledge instead of competing. Why can't we do the same thing with technology? The Pacific Northwest Small Business Technology Cooperative now served over 200 member businesses across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Members paid modest annual dues that funded group purchasing agreements for software and hardware, shared training resources, and emergency support services. Instead of paying individual consulting firms thousands of dollars for basic services, members could access expertise through the cooperative at a fraction of the cost. But the cooperative's impact extended far beyond cost savings. It had created a network of businesses that supported each other through technology challenges, shared resources during difficult periods, and collaborated on solutions that benefited entire industries. The restaurant owners in David Park's network had developed a shared point-of-sale system that could be customized for different types of cuisine, but maintain compatibility for group purchasing and data sharing. Maria Santos had worked with other accountants to create industry-specific templates and workflows that could be shared freely among members. Most importantly, the cooperative had established the industry's first ethical consulting standards, with member consultants signing binding commitments to transparency, client empowerment, and long-term relationship building rather than short-term revenue extraction. The standards hadn't been welcomed by the established consulting industry. McKinsey & Company had issued a white paper questioning the sustainability and professionalism of cooperative consulting models. Deloitte's managing partners had lobbied the Washington State Business Association to exclude cooperatives from industry certification programs. But the market was speaking louder than industry lobbying. Small businesses that had been burned by TechFlow and similar firms were actively seeking alternatives. The cooperative's membership waiting list had grown to over 400 businesses, with similar organizations forming in Texas, North Carolina, and Illinois. The recognition had come from unexpected directions. Harvard Business School had invited Isolde to present a case study on cooperative models in professional services. The United Nations Small Business Development Program had cited the cooperative as a model for sustainable technology adoption in developing economies. Most meaningfully, the work had attracted the attention of other industries where extraction-based business models were harming smaller players. Healthcare consultants were adapting the cooperative model to help independent medical practices resist corporate consolidation. Agricultural consultants were using similar principles to help family farms compete with agribusiness giants.
Jennifer had emerged as the cooperative's technical director, overseeing a team of 15 consultant members who handled complex system migrations and emergency responses. But her most important work involved debugging and documenting the sabotage techniques that were still being discovered in legacy TechFlow installations. The forensic work had revealed that TechFlow's practices were more widespread than initially suspected. Similar sabotage techniques were found in systems installed by other major consulting firms, suggesting that deliberate dependency creation was an industry-wide strategy rather than an isolated ethical failure. "It's not just about the money," Jennifer explained to a documentary crew that was filming a piece about the scandal. "It's about power. These firms don't just want to be paid for their services, they want to control their clients' ability to make independent decisions." The documentary, Digital Sharecroppers, had premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was scheduled for national broadcast on PBS. It told the story of the TechFlow scandal through the experiences of affected businesses, but focused primarily on the cooperative's emergence as a sustainable alternative. The film had helped shift public perception of the crisis from an isolated business dispute to a broader question about economic justice in the digital age.
Small business advocacy groups across the country were now lobbying for regulations that would require technology consultants to provide client-owned backups of all data and systems, eliminate mandatory arbitration clauses in consulting contracts, and establish industry standards for transparent, empowering consulting practices. But the most significant changes were happening at the grassroots level, in the daily operations of businesses that had moved from dependency to independence. Cascade Dining Group had not only recovered from the TechFlow crisis, but had grown to include 2 additional restaurants, all operating on systems designed and maintained through the cooperative. David Park had become something of an evangelist for the independence model, speaking at Restaurant Association conferences about the importance of understanding and controlling their own technology. "We're not anti-technology," he would tell audiences. "We're pro-independence. We want tools that make us stronger, not systems that make us dependent." Rosa Martinez's bakery had become an unofficial headquarters for small business technology education in the International District. She hosted monthly digital literacy for small business workshops in her back room, teaching fellow entrepreneurs basic cybersecurity, data management, and vendor evaluation skills. The workshops were always full, with waiting lists that stretched for months. Business owners came to learn practical skills, but often left with something more valuable: the confidence that they could understand and control the technology that their businesses depended on. Maria Santos had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation. Her accounting practice now specialized in helping small businesses evaluate and escape predatory consulting relationships. She'd developed a forensic accounting methodology specifically designed to identify and document extraction-based billing practices. "I can spot vendor lock-in schemes now from a mile away," she told clients during consultation sessions, "and more importantly, I can show you how to avoid them in the future." The ripple effects extended into unexpected areas. The University of Washington's Information School had revised their curriculum to include mandatory courses on ethical consulting practices. Seattle University's business program now required students to complete cooperative consulting projects with local small businesses. Regional banks had begun offering loans specifically designed to help small businesses transition away from predatory consulting relationships. The loans included technical assistance funding that could be used to hire cooperative consultants for system migrations and independence planning. Even the city government had taken notice. Seattle had become the first municipality to establish procurement preferences for businesses that could demonstrate technological
Independence, the ability to maintain their own systems without relying on vendor lock-in relationships. The policy was controversial among established consulting firms, but popular with taxpayers who appreciated seeing city contracts going to businesses that weren't beholden to expensive, ongoing maintenance relationships with corporate consultants. As the first anniversary of the TechFlow revelations approached, Isolde found herself reflecting on how much had changed. The woman who had started Bennett Digital Solutions as a desperate attempt to create meaningful work had become the inadvertent leader of a regional movement toward economic justice. But the success brought new challenges. The cooperative was growing faster than they could train new consultants. Member businesses were requesting services, legal advocacy, group health insurance, cooperative marketing, that extended far beyond technology consulting. Most importantly, they were being watched carefully by the established consulting industry, which had begun developing counter-strategies designed to undermine cooperative models. McKinsey had launched a small business partnership initiative that offered services at dramatically reduced rates, clearly a loss leader strategy designed to prevent businesses from joining cooperatives. Deloitte had begun acquiring small regional consulting firms, apparently attempting to create a network that could compete with cooperatives on local relationships while maintaining corporate profit structures. "They're trying to co-opt us," Jennifer observed during one of their strategic planning sessions. "Offer enough of what we provide to prevent businesses from seeking real independence." The challenge was significant, but not insurmountable. The cooperative model had advantages that corporate firms couldn't replicate: genuine community investment, transparent pricing, member ownership of both problems and solutions,
and consultants who were incentivized to work themselves out of jobs rather than create ongoing dependencies. More fundamentally, the cooperative had created something that extraction-based firms couldn't match: trust. Small business owners who had been burned by predatory consulting relationships weren't easily fooled by superficial changes in corporate marketing. "You can't fake genuine care," Rosa Martinez had observed. "Our members know that cooperative consultants succeed when their businesses succeed, not when they need more consulting." The regional success was attracting national attention from both supporters and critics. The Wall Street Journal had run a feature story questioning whether cooperative models could scale beyond local markets. Fortune magazine had published a critical piece suggesting that cooperative consulting was unsustainable idealism that would ultimately fail when confronted with complex enterprise-level problems. But the criticism was increasingly offset by results. Member businesses in the cooperative were reporting higher technology satisfaction rates, lower total cost of ownership for their systems, and greater confidence in their ability to make strategic technology decisions. Perhaps more importantly, they were reporting improved business outcomes across all areas, not just technology. The cooperative's emphasis on independence and empowerment seemed to have spillover effects, making business owners more confident about negotiating with suppliers, more willing to explore new markets, more likely to invest in growth opportunities. "Independence is contagious," David Park had remarked during a cooperative annual meeting. "Once you realize you can control your own technology, you start questioning other relationships where you've been accepting dependency." As Isolde prepared for the cooperative's first annual conference, scheduled for the following month, she found herself thinking about her great-grandfather's compass. The device was designed to find magnetic north, but experienced navigators knew that magnetic north and true north were different things, and that the difference varied depending on where you were in the world. The consulting industry's magnetic north, maximize revenue, create dependencies, extract value, had been pulling businesses in the wrong direction for decades. The cooperative represented an attempt to find true north, empower clients, build independence, create sustainable value.
The compass still sat on her windowsill, now in the cooperative's headquarters rather than her apartment. Members often noticed it during meetings and asked about its significance. When Isolde told the story of her great-grandfather navigating through wartime storms, they understood immediately. "That's what we're all doing," one member had said, "learning to navigate by true north instead of following the magnetic pull of what everyone else is doing." The metaphor had become central to the cooperative's identity. Their logo featured a compass rose, and new member orientation included a discussion of the difference between magnetic north and true north in business decision-making. But as the cooperative prepared to scale beyond regional operations, Isolde knew they were entering uncharted waters. The principles that worked for 200 businesses in the Pacific Northwest would face new challenges when applied to 2,000 businesses across multiple regions, different industries, and varying regulatory environments. The real test of their model wasn't whether it could succeed on a small scale, but whether it could provide a sustainable alternative to extraction-based consulting across the entire economy. The answer would determine not just the future of the cooperative, but the possibility of an economy where small businesses could thrive independently rather than merely surviving as dependent tenants in someone else's digital empire. 3 years later, the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the same certified mail formality that had once carried TechFlow's rejection of Bennett Digital Solutions. But this envelope bore the letterhead of Meridian Corp, and the signature at the bottom belonged to the same CTO who had once dismissed Isolde's work as lacking gravitas. "Dear Ms. Bennett, we are writing to formally request a partnership with the Pacific Northwest Small Business Technology Cooperative. Recent market developments have led us to reconsider our approach to small business consulting, and we believe your organization's expertise would be valuable to our clients." Isolde read the letter twice before setting it aside, not with anger, but with a kind of bemused satisfaction.
Meridian Corp, the company that had once called her business a joke, was now seeking her help as their own small business clients increasingly demanded the independence-focused consulting model that the cooperative had pioneered. The irony was rich but unsurprising. In the 3 years since the TechFlow scandal, the consulting industry had undergone seismic changes that no one could have predicted. What had started as a regional response to corporate sabotage had evolved into a national movement that was reshaping how businesses thought about technology, consulting, and economic independence. The Pacific Northwest Small Business Technology Cooperative now served over 3,000 member businesses across 12 states, with affiliated cooperatives operating in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. The model had been adapted for healthcare, agriculture, manufacturing, and financial services, creating a network of sector-specific cooperatives that shared resources and best practices. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation was cultural, philosophical, and deeply personal for the thousands of business owners who had moved from dependency to independence. 5 years later, Jennifer Walsh stood at the podium of the International Conference on Cooperative Economics, addressing an audience of 800 business leaders, academics, and policymakers from 43 countries. The conference was being held in Seattle, in the convention center that overlooked Elliott Bay and the city that had become synonymous with the cooperative consulting movement.
When we started documenting TechFlow's sabotage practices, she told the audience, we thought we were just helping a few dozen businesses recover from corporate betrayal. We didn't realize we were uncovering the architecture of an entire economic system based on artificial scarcity and engineered dependence. The presentation that followed traced the evolution of cooperative consulting from emergency response to sustainable alternative to mainstream business practice. Jennifer showed slides documenting the growth curve from 12 businesses in one workshop to 50,000 businesses in affiliated cooperatives worldwide. But the most powerful slides weren't about numbers. They were about stories. David Park, who now owned 12 restaurants across the Pacific Northwest, all operating on cooperative-designed systems that had never experienced a single day of unplanned downtime. Rosa Martinez, whose bakery had become the anchor business for a food cooperative that supplied 30 restaurants and grocery stores with locally made products. Maria Santos, who had transitioned from accounting to policy work and was now the director of the Federal Small Business Technology Independence Office, a new government agency created to regulate predatory consulting practices and support cooperative alternatives. The cooperative model didn't just solve a technology problem, Jennifer concluded. It proved that business relationships based on empowerment rather than extraction aren't just more ethical. They're more profitable, more sustainable, and more resilient. The audience included representatives from several major consulting firms that had adapted cooperative principles into their own practices. McKinsey & Company now offered independence consulting services that helped large corporations support rather than exploit their small business suppliers. Deloitte had created a cooperative partnership division that worked with member businesses to solve industry-wide challenges. The changes hadn't come easily or without resistance. Traditional consulting firms had fought cooperative expansion through lobbying, litigation, and aggressive price competition. Several cooperatives had failed when they couldn't withstand well-funded corporate campaigns designed to undermine their credibility and steal their clients. But for every cooperative that failed, 2 more emerged, often stronger and more sophisticated than their predecessors. The movement had developed its own investment networks, legal defense funds, and policy advocacy organizations that could match corporate resources with grassroots organizing power. 7 years later, Isolde Bennett's office in the National Cooperative Consulting Institute overlooked the Potomac River, a view that still surprised her on mornings when she arrived before dawn to prepare for congressional testimony or regulatory meetings. The institute, headquartered in Washington, D.C.,
had become the primary research and advocacy organization for cooperative business models worldwide. The transformation of American small business had been documented in dozens of academic studies, government reports, and business school case studies. The independence movement was now recognized as one of the most significant economic developments of the early 21st century, comparable to the rise of the internet or the shift to service-based economies. But Isolde's favorite research came from her own organization's longitudinal study of the original TechFlow victims. 7 years after their systems had been sabotaged, 93% of the businesses that had joined cooperatives were still operating and profitable. 87% had grown their revenue by at least 50%. Most remarkably, 96% reported that they felt confident and empowered in their technology decision-making. The control group, businesses that had addressed their TechFlow problems through traditional consulting relationships, showed dramatically different outcomes. Only 64% were still operating. Average revenue growth was 12%, and only 31% reported confidence in their technology decisions. Independence isn't just a philosophical preference, Isolde had written in her book, Digital Democracy, How Small Businesses Transformed the Economy by Taking Control of Their Technology. It's a competitive advantage that compounds over time.
The book had become required reading in business schools and policy programs, but its greatest impact had been among business owners who saw their own struggles reflected in the stories of entrepreneurs who had moved from dependence to independence. 10 years later, the 10th anniversary conference of the TechFlow scandal was held not in Seattle, but in Detroit, in a convention center that had been built through a cooperative development model that brought together small businesses, community organizations, and local government. The choice of location was symbolic. Detroit had become the epicenter of cooperative economic development, a city where small businesses had rebuilt entire neighborhoods through collaborative ownership and mutual support. Rosa Martinez, now 67 and the chair emeritus of the National Small Business Cooperative Alliance, delivered the keynote address to an audience of 2,000 business owners, consultants, academics, and government officials. 10 years ago, my bakery was dying because of systems designed to steal from small businesses, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through transformation. Today, that same bakery is the anchor of a food cooperative that employs 147 people and serves communities across 3 states. The audience included dozens of people whose careers had been shaped by the events that began with TechFlow's collapse. Former TechFlow employees who had become cooperative consultants, small business owners who had built thriving enterprises on independence-focused technology, young entrepreneurs who couldn't imagine starting a business without cooperative support structures. But perhaps the most significant attendees were the representatives from major corporations that had adapted their practices in response to cooperative competition. Amazon Web Services now offered cooperative cloud hosting specifically designed to prevent vendor lock-in. Microsoft had created independent software that could be easily migrated between different platforms and service providers. Even TechFlow's successor companies, the private equity firm had eventually sold the intellectual property to 3 different consulting firms, now marketed themselves as providers of empowerment-based consulting that prioritized client independence over vendor dependencies. The transformation hadn't been limited to technology consulting. Cooperative models had spread to legal services, marketing, financial planning, and healthcare, creating an alternative economy based on mutual support rather than competitive extraction. Universities had established cooperative business programs that taught students to build enterprises focused on community empowerment rather than shareholder maximization. Cities had created cooperative development zones that provided tax incentives and regulatory support for businesses that committed to independence-based practices. Most significantly, a new generation of entrepreneurs had grown up expecting cooperation rather than competition, empowerment rather than exploitation, and transparency rather than vendor lock-in.
They were building businesses that their predecessors would have considered impossibly idealistic, but that were proving to be more sustainable and profitable than traditional models. 15 years later, Isolde Bennett, now 55, stood in the same Georgetown warehouse where the Pacific Northwest Small Business Technology Cooperative had been born. The space had been converted into a museum and educational center, with exhibits tracing the evolution of cooperative economics from a regional experiment to global movement. Visitors came from around the world to understand how a crisis created by corporate greed had catalyzed the development of an alternative economic system based on mutual aid and shared prosperity. School groups toured the exhibits, learning about the difference between extraction-based and empowerment-based business models. International delegations studied the policy innovations that had supported cooperative development.
But the most frequent visitors were young entrepreneurs, people in their 20s and 30s who were starting businesses in an economy where cooperative principles had become mainstream rather than alternative. "I can't imagine trying to build a business without cooperative support," one visitor told Isolde during a guided tour. "The idea of paying some consultant thousands of dollars to create systems that I couldn't understand or control, that sounds like a nightmare." The comment reflected how completely the business landscape had changed. What had once been revolutionary was now conventional wisdom. Businesses performed better when they controlled their own systems, made decisions based on complete information, and built relationships based on mutual empowerment rather than one-sided dependency. The success hadn't eliminated all forms of predatory consulting, but it had made them increasingly marginal and economically unsustainable. Business owners educated in cooperative principles could recognize and avoid extraction-based relationships. Industry regulations required transparency in consulting contracts and prohibited the kind of deliberate sabotage that TechFlow had practiced. Most importantly, the cultural shift had created expectations that made predatory practices socially unacceptable, as well as economically unprofitable. Business consultants who prioritized their own profits over client empowerment found themselves excluded from professional networks and unable to attract clients. As Isolde walked through the museum exhibits, she paused at a display case that contained her great-grandfather's compass, now a permanent part of the collection. The brass had tarnished slightly over the decades, but the needle still pointed steadily north, as reliable as ever. A plaque beside the case explained the compass's significance. This navigation instrument, carried by merchant marine captain William Bennett during World War II, became a symbol of the choice between magnetic north, following what others do, and true north, following principles and purpose. His great-granddaughter, Isolde Bennett, used this same compass as inspiration for building business relationships based on true north principles: empowerment over extraction, independence over dependence, community over profit. The museum's final exhibit was a video wall showing contemporary cooperative businesses from around the world. Restaurants in Sao Paulo, manufacturing cooperatives in Bangladesh, technology firms in Berlin, agricultural cooperatives in Kenya. All of them traced their origins to principles developed in response to TechFlow's betrayal of small business trust. But the most moving part of the exhibit was a simple quote from David Park, recorded during his final interview before retiring from restaurant management to teach cooperative business development at Seattle University. "We didn't just build better technology systems, we built better relationships. And it turned out that better relationships were the foundation for everything else. Better businesses, better communities, better lives." 20 years later, the letter that arrived on Isolde's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning was handwritten, delivered by regular mail rather than certified delivery. It came from a college student in Ohio who was writing a senior thesis about the TechFlow scandal and its aftermath. "Dear Miss Bennett, I'm studying the cooperative movement that began after TechFlow's collapse, and I wanted to ask you something that isn't in any of the books or articles I've read. Do you think the world would have changed anyway, even without TechFlow's sabotage? Were you and the other cooperative founders just responding to one crisis, or were you part of something larger?" It was a question that Isolde had been asked many times over the years, in interviews and lectures and policy meetings. The academic consensus was that the TechFlow scandal had been a catalyst rather than a cause,
that underlying tensions between extraction-based and empowerment-based business models had been building for decades, and that some kind of transformation was inevitable. But as Isolde sat at her kitchen table, reading the student's question by the morning light that streamed through her window, she found herself thinking not about historical inevitability, but about individual choices made by specific people in particular moments.
Rosa Martinez could have closed her bakery instead of trusting a consultant she'd never heard of. Jennifer Walsh could have found another corporate job instead of examining her own role in TechFlow sabotage. David Park could have accepted bankruptcy instead of reaching out for help at 2:47 a.m., rather than convenience. The cumulative effect of thousands of such choices had created what historians now called the cooperative revolution, but it had started with individuals deciding to trust their compass rather than follow the crowd. The compass still sat on her windowsill, 25 years after she'd first held it during her crisis of confidence about leaving TechFlow. The apartment was different now, larger, brighter, filled with books and photographs and mementos from a career spent building alternatives to systems that had seemed immutable. She picked up the compass, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. The needle swung gently before settling on magnetic north, pointing toward the window that still faced downtown Seattle. But the skyline had changed dramatically over the decades. Where TechFlow's headquarters had once dominated the view, a cluster of cooperative-owned buildings now housed dozens of small businesses that shared resources, supported each other's growth, and built wealth within their communities rather than extracting it for distant shareholders. Isolde wrote her response to the student by hand, using the same fountain pen she'd used to sign her resignation letter from TechFlow 25 years earlier. Dear Sarah, you ask whether the world would have changed anyway, and I think the answer is both yes and no. The conditions for transformation were certainly building. Small businesses were increasingly frustrated with predatory consulting, technology was becoming more democratic, and a generation of entrepreneurs was questioning traditional business models. But conditions don't create change by themselves. Change happens when specific people make specific choices at specific moments. Rosa Martinez could have given up instead of trusting a stranger with her bakery's future. Jennifer Walsh could have kept quiet instead of exposing the sabotage she'd helped create. David Park could have declared bankruptcy instead of asking for help. The TechFlow scandal didn't create the cooperative movement, but it created a moment when the choice between different kinds of business relationships became unavoidably clear. And enough people chose empowerment over extraction, community over profit, true north over magnetic north, that their individual decisions accumulated into social transformation. I keep my great-grandfather's compass not because it shows me which way to go, but because it reminds me that I have to choose my own direction. In business, as in navigation, the easy path isn't always the right path. Sometimes you have to set your own course, even when, especially when, everyone else is heading in a different direction. Your generation has inherited an economy where cooperative principles seem natural and normal, but they weren't always natural or normal. They became mainstream because thousands of people chose to swim upstream, to build businesses based on empowerment rather than exploitation, to trust that treating clients as partners rather than profit sources would somehow be sustainable. It turned out to be more than sustainable. It turned out to be transformational. The real lesson of the TechFlow story isn't about technology or consulting or even business models. It's about the accumulated power of individual choices made with moral clarity. Every time someone chooses empowerment over extraction, cooperation over competition, community over profit, they make it easier for the next person to make the same choice. That's how change happens, not through grand strategies or revolutionary manifestos, but through ordinary people making extraordinary choices, one decision at a time, until the extraordinary becomes ordinary and the impossible becomes inevitable. Keep asking the right questions, Sarah. The world needs more people who wonder not just what happened, but what's possible.
Sincerely, Isolde Bennett.
As she sealed the envelope, Isolde thought about the final irony of her story. She'd started Bennett Digital Solutions to prove that small business consulting could be profitable without being predatory. She'd succeeded beyond her wildest imagination, but the success had made her original goal almost irrelevant. The consulting industry had been so thoroughly transformed that predatory practices had become economically unsustainable. Young consultants learned empowerment-based methods as standard practice. Business schools taught cooperative principles as conventional wisdom. Government regulations prohibited the kind of vendor lock-in strategies that had once been routine. Most remarkably, the transformation had spread far beyond consulting into every aspect of economic life. Manufacturing cooperatives shared equipment and expertise to compete with multinational corporations. Retail cooperatives pooled purchasing power to support local suppliers. Financial cooperatives provided capital for community development instead of extracting wealth for distant investors. The changes had been so comprehensive that most people under 30 couldn't imagine an economy based primarily on extraction and competition rather than cooperation and mutual aid. What had once been radical had become normal. What had once been impossible had become inevitable. 25 years later. The final document in Isolde Bennett's papers, discovered after her death at age 71, was a handwritten note dated 3 days before she passed away. It was found folded inside her great-grandfather's compass case, written in the careful script of someone who wanted to be sure her words were understood. To whoever finds this, I've spent 25 years trying to understand what really happened when TechFlow collapsed and why the cooperative movement succeeded when so many other alternative business models have failed. I think the answer is simpler than most of the academic studies suggest. We succeeded because we started with the assumption that business relationships should be based on trust rather than control, empowerment rather than dependence, truth rather than manipulation. These weren't revolutionary ideas. They were basic principles that most people already believed in their personal relationships. We just applied them to business relationships, and it turned out that businesses based on trust, empowerment, and truth were more profitable, more sustainable, and more fulfilling than businesses based on extraction and exploitation. The compass that guided me through this work was actually quite simple. Whenever I faced a business decision, I asked myself whether it would make my clients more independent or more dependent, more empowered or more vulnerable, more capable of making their own decisions or less capable. The needle always pointed in the same direction, toward empowerment, toward independence, toward truth. Following that direction led to everything else: the cooperative movement, the transformation of consulting, the creation of an alternative economy based on mutual aid rather than mutual exploitation. I'm writing this because I want people to understand that transformation is always possible, but it requires individuals to choose principles over profits, long-term relationships over short-term gains, community empowerment over personal advantage. The compass is yours now. Use it wisely. The world still needs people who can tell the difference between magnetic north and true north, who can choose their own direction even when everyone else is following a different path. Most importantly, remember that change doesn't happen through grand gestures or revolutionary manifestos. It happens through ordinary people making extraordinary choices, one decision at a time, until the extraordinary becomes normal and the impossible becomes inevitable. There's still work to do. There always is. The question isn't whether the world needs changing. It always does. The question is whether you'll be one of the people who chooses to change it. Choose true north. The rest will follow.
Isolde Bennett, founder, Bennett Digital Solutions, and the Pacific Northwest Small Business Technology Cooperative.
The note was discovered by Jennifer Walsh, now in her 70s, but still serving as the Director Emeritus of the National Cooperative Consulting Institute. She read it aloud at Isolde's memorial service, held in the same Georgetown warehouse where their partnership had begun 30 years earlier. The service was attended by over 1,000 people, small business owners whose enterprises had been saved by cooperative consulting, policymakers who had helped create the regulatory framework that supported cooperative development, young entrepreneurs who had grown up in an economy where cooperation was the norm rather than the exception. But the most moving tributes came from the original clients. Rosa Martinez, now 82 and still baking, though she'd turned daily operations over to her daughter. David Park, whose 12 restaurants had evolved into a worker-owned cooperative that employed 400 people. Maria Santos, whose accounting practice had become a teaching hospital for cooperative business development. "She didn't just save our businesses," Rosa said during her eulogy. "She showed us that business could be about building community rather than extracting profit, about empowering people rather than making them dependent. She taught us the difference between magnetic north and true north, and then she trusted us to find our own way." The memorial service concluded with the installation of Isolde's compass in a new, permanent exhibit at the museum. The display case was positioned near the entrance, where every visitor would see it immediately upon arriving. The plaque beside it read simply, "True North, a compass for business and life, donated by Isolde Bennett, 1989-2063, who proved that the most practical thing you can do is follow your principles." As the service ended and people filed out into the Seattle evening, the compass needle settled on magnetic north as it had for over a century. But the people who had been touched by Isolde's work carried with them something more reliable than magnetic attraction: the knowledge that they could choose their own direction, that they could build businesses and communities based on empowerment rather than extraction, that they could follow true north even when magnetic north pulled them toward easier but less meaningful paths. The transformation that had begun with one woman's decision to help a struggling bakery had evolved into a global movement that changed how people thought about business, community, and the possibility of building an economy that served human flourishing rather than merely generating profit. But perhaps the most important legacy wasn't the institutional changes or policy innovations or economic transformation. It was the simple, revolutionary idea that had guided everything else. Business relationships, like all human relationships, work better when they're based on trust, empowerment, and mutual aid rather than manipulation, dependence, and exploitation. That idea, like the compass needle, pointed steadily toward true north, and 25 years of following that direction had proved that principles weren't just idealistic aspirations. They were practical tools for building a better world, one relationship at a time, one business at a time, one choice at a time. The needle never wavered. True north remained true north, regardless of the magnetic forces trying to pull it in other directions. And in a world full of competing attractions and false promises, that constancy was perhaps the most valuable gift of all: the knowledge that some things remain reliable, that some directions lead to destinations worth reaching, that some choices matter more than others. The compass was silent, as compasses always are, but its message was clear to anyone who took the time to read it. Choose your direction carefully. Follow your principles consistently. Trust that true north will guide you home. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.